That's up to you. I mean, you can do it for
I
half an hour or something, then we'll go for the Q&A session.
So half
It's
an hour
totally up to you.
presentation and then
the live stream has
Huh, huh.
started.
Yes, sir. Half an hour and then we'll go for the Q&A.
okay, I had 45 minutes in
The live stream has started.
work around that.
Okay, okay, sir.
Anubhav, the live stream has
That's
started.
okay. That's okay. Fine. Mute. Okay. Let's see. That's good. Okay. Yeah, it's all there. Live chat is open. So we'll just copy the questions from the YouTube chat, sir, and then paste it here in the Jitsi chat.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Assuming that there is audience on the other side.
हाँ hopefully some कुछ लोग will be there. I shared this जादवपुर यूनिवर्सिटी में प्रेसिडेंसी में and अम्बेडकर में कुछ लोगों को सर शेयर किया. Hopefully some people will come.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sir. So let's begin. Okay. So, okay. So we are here for the session Imperialism in the 21st Century. We from AES organized this session believing that this is something that is not taught in the conventional economics courses in almost anywhere in our country. So I'll just give you all a brief history about what AES Alternative Economic Society is, and a brief history and a brief about Professor Rohit Azad here. So AES was basically conceived by a group of students at Jadavpur University who believed that the economics is an instrument of class war, that something it has become a very narrow, constricted discipline. It is very much limited to the holy trinity of micro, macro, and maths. And as such, the real issues that are out there, the real reasons why we set out to study economics, to study society, to solve societal problems, those were missing. As a counter chain to dominant class approaches, we at AES we strive to get into this heterodox schools of thought, be it institutional economics, be it feminist political economy. We have with us Dr. Rohit Azad here today. We are very fortunate to have him with us. Dr. Rohit Azad has done his PhD in economics from JNU. He teaches economics at CESP JNU. He has been a Fulbright doctoral fellow at University of Massachusetts at Amherst during August 2006 to May 2007. His areas of interest include macroeconomic theory, monetary economics, and growth theory. We'll just give it over to Rohit sir here, and a big thank you to him for addressing this session today.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thanks, Anubhav, and thank you for creating or being part of. You may not be the founding member of you. If you are, then even better, of the Alternative Economic Society. Given, as you rightly said, what is happening to economics, we need to think beyond what we are normally taught in universities or colleges. So I'll share the screen. My only worry is that it's a slide. It's a topic which is kind of really not obviously not mainstream, but also even within the heterodox, let's say, framework, a little too dense. So please pardon me if it comes across as that. But since Anubhav had asked me to talk about imperialism, I would. This is a recent paper that we have developed, I and a colleague of mine, Shovik, which is what I want to present before you. So, this is not a published paper, it's a working paper. So you're effectively becoming guinea pigs in this experiment. All right, so I'll make it full screen and then just 1 second. So just to check, you guys can see this?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
All right, okay. All right. So basically, in the I'm assuming that people are aware of, since it's a alternative economic society. I'm sure you've had sessions, or generally you're aware of broadly the Marxian tradition in the theories of imperialism. And we are basically picking two Marxian traditions which follow from Marx's own analysis on crisis in capitalism. One, which is, both of which are very well known, but one which comes from, in my opinion, the supply side in Marx, which is essentially the technological limit, what he had called the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. That's one of the Marxian traditions, and from which flows a tradition of imperialism where many authors, in particular the most prominent being David Harvey, and others who have written from that perspective. So that's one tradition. The second one I'll come to. And the idea is basically that the rate of profit falls as a result of rising intensity of capital in production. So basically capital intensity, if we were to put it in simple terms, that rises as there's growth and accumulation in the economy, and that effectively leads to a fall in the rate of profit. And the argument that people in this tradition make is that because you have concentration taking place in the first world, they were the first movers. Eventually, when the rates of profit start falling, you look for opportunities outside that space that you're in, which happens to be, which is what Harvey's argument is, that you look for a spatial fix. So you basically start exporting capital to regions where the intensity is still very low. So you're essentially making profits there to compensate for the loss of profits in your own space. And that expansion of capital, that spatial fix, is what constitutes imperialism. That's, I mean, putting it, I mean, obviously it's a complex argument, far more complex than what I've just said, but it's essentially that tradition which is quite prominent, and Harvey is just an example of that. The problem with this tradition, and that's why we do not agree with this, is that the argument of falling rate of profit itself is built on a theoretically problematic argument, which we can discuss if you want later, and it is a supply side explanation. So even though the conclusion may be correct that capital is diffusing in the periphery, the premise from, or the theoretical premise from which they start this argument itself is faulty. As you can see, actually on the right hand side, that rate of profit has by and large been pretty much constant. It falls, then goes back up. If you take Marx's rate of profit, you can define rate of profit in different ways. The reason, the capital intensity bit is here, what Marx had called the organic composition of capital. And you can see that it's pretty flat. There is no such thing as a rise in organic composition of capital. And this is the theoretical argument against Marx's point that he was making about falling rate of profit. If this does not happen, there is no tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is what you see in these three graphs. Sorry if things are not clear, we can discuss them later. Or if you prefer to have a discussion along the presentation, I don't mind that either. But I don't know, since it's a different medium, it may be difficult to do it in terms of while the talk is on. So I'll proceed. The second tradition is basically the other side of Marx, which was, instead of from the supply side, instead from the technology side, you actually have what is called the realization problem, which is essentially from the demand side, something which was discovered much later.
Yes. Sorry to disturb you. I think the PPT is not visible at this moment.
Oh, it's not visible. Nothing.
Right. No, right now it's a blank screen. I think.
Sorry. So at what point did it disappear?
Around 2 minutes back, I think.
Was this visible or none of this was visible?
No, this wasn't visible. The previous one is visible. Yeah, the second one was visible. Yeah, second one was visible for a brief moment and then it disappeared. This two Marxian tradition one.
This is what I. Sorry, then you'll have to give me 2-3 minutes extra.
Yeah. No problem, sir. No problem.
So basically, this is the point I was trying to make, which, as you know, that in Marx there was this argument about the organic composition of capital rising over time, which makes the rate of profit to fall, because rate of profit, as you know, is profit by capital. And with every unit of output, if more and more capital is embodied, then obviously the rate of profit would start falling over a period of time. But what the data shows you is that the organic composition of capital, can you see the mouse when I move? Is that visible, the hand which is moving? Or can you not see?
Yes, sir, that's visible. That's visible.
So you can see that this is essentially flat. So there is no long-term tendency of this rising, which is what Marx's argument was. And as a result, as you can see, that there is no tendency of the rate of profit to fall. It's been pretty much, it goes down, then has gone back up, but there is no consistent tendency. This is from 1948 to 2016, so a long period in which we are discussing this, about 8 years, and yet you do not find such a tendency which Marx was talking about. And the reason is that it's a theoretically problematic argument to make. So even though this tradition may predict the data well in terms of diffusion of capital in periphery, so in that sense, the conclusion may be correct, but the premise on which they start their theory itself is wrong. So you may have diffusion in the periphery, but not because the rate of profit was falling, but for completely different reasons, which is what our argument is, which I'll come to later. The second tradition, as I said, there are two Marxian traditions, core Marxian traditions. The other tradition, other Marxian theory of crisis, comes from the demand side, not from the technology side. And the argument is actually pretty simple, that the expansion of capacity is such that the demand need not necessarily match up to it, and you end up having realization problems, or what in modern parlance would be demand problem, which Keynes discovered much later and was associated with his name, even though Marx had argued it before him, way before him. And so there are a lot of people in this tradition, Rosa Luxemburg, the dependency school, world systems, where their argument is that the capitalist core, let's say the G7 countries today, there's growth in them, and there is a pre-capitalist or semi-capitalist or non-capitalist periphery, which is at the receiving end of this imperialist, the model of imperialism. And the reason why you have that is because imperialism provides external markets to the capitalist core. And the reason why it needs external markets is because, as I said, domestically there is a problem of realization of profit. So you start basically looking for opportunities outside. And the reason is not technology. The reason is demand. And they are very opposite arguments. So please keep that in mind. So according to them, you would have basically deindustrialization in the periphery. The example, which is very well known, is the Indian case during British colonialism, which is very well known, where the growth takes place in the global north. There's an additional argument that in the process, what happens, this is the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, that the terms of trade moves against the peripheral commodities. And that is because of the fact that there's suppression in terms of the exchange rate. And the reason why it is important is, and let me just spend a minute on this, that any financial system can sustain itself if the currency is stable. I mean, if, let's say today, the reserve currency, which is dollar, is not stable. Let's say there is huge inflation that starts taking place in the United States, and rest of the economies have moderate inflation, in which case people will lose faith in dollar and would start withdrawing from dollar. The fact that it has not happened is something which needs an explanation, and this framework explains it by saying that you maintain the stability by suppressing the workers in the, or the proletariat in the periphery, because you buy their commodities at a lower price, you keep suppressing them, in which case the domestic wage price spiral that would have happened never takes place, because there's always this one class of agents which are lying outside your territory, who you can suppress all the time to maintain the stability of your own currency. That's the argument that this tradition makes. Prabhat Patnaik, as I said, Luxemburg, and others. And their argument is that this is how it is maintained. Now, while they do not, there's no problem with their argument in terms of the problem of capitalism, which is realization, but their conclusions could not be further away from truth. In fact, when I teach this in my course, everybody says, but sir, the world today is the exact opposite. In fact, the periphery has grown, at least some part of the periphery has grown faster than the core. And this is particularly so during neoliberalism. And so much so that other thinkers like Hart and Negri have argued that we find the first world in the third in the first, and second almost nowhere at all, second being the socialist world. And further, the United States does not, and indeed no nation state can today form the center of an imperialist project. Imperialism is over. No nation will be world leader in the way modern European nations were. This is one argument which has come from within the left, saying that imperialism itself is over. Our argument is the opposite of this, but I'm just giving you what the argument that they've made. And as you can see, sorry if it may not be visible, but this green line is essentially the share of China, which is actually periphery. Periphery is where you have huge labor reserves, and China happens to be the biggest labor reserve in the global economy. And you can see that there, not only is their share not falling, or not only is there no squeeze of the Chinese economy, you actually see that rising at the cost of the global north. So the exact opposite of the world systems argument, so to speak, especially during post-1980s. Same thing with the terms of trade. You actually find that the terms of trade have moved in favor of primary commodities. So the exact opposite of the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. Now, if both these grounds or both these conclusions that come out of this second tradition are also wrong, then there is something fundamentally wrong with this argument as well. There are many more traditions. I should not, straitjacket everything in these two, but these two form, let's say, they come out of two different readings of Marx as far as imperialism is concerned. One which comes from the technology side, the other which comes from the demand side. And as I've just shown to you, both from data refuting the basic arguments that they are trying to make. Then comes the question, is it indeed the case that what Hart and Negri are saying, that imperialism is over? It's not relevant anymore. You have a China, you have the emerging market economies, then where is the US hegemony? And we would like to argue against that, because that is taking the argument a little too far. Not only that, in fact, today's imperialism is far more aggressive, not in terms of necessarily, bombing countries. That of course happens, but bombing countries or war by the United States is not a necessary condition to establish imperialism. You can have a situation where you have Joe Biden as the president and yet imperialism, or to an extent that even Bernie Sanders being the president of the United States and US imperialism still existing. And that's what I want to explain now. Obviously, the face of that imperialism would vary if you have a George Bush or you have Bernie Sanders, but then there is that basic economic system of that imperialism stays intact. And what is that system is what I want to discuss now, and I'll try and do it as fast as I can, or as quickly as I can. So look at the United States today. It has had consistently low rates of growth for decades now. Deindustrialization, which is the slogan of Trump, "Make America Great Again," with which he won the elections. This is exactly what was at the center of that campaign, which got huge support from the people. And it was true. There is indeed huge deindustrialization that has taken place in the United States because of outsourcing. The international indebtedness is very high, again, because it runs huge trade deficits. And yet, what you find is that the US continues to hold the reserve currency. Now, any other country today, if it had been in the same situation as the US, actually money would have flowed out of that economy. Let's say if this were to happen to China or to Germany or any of the trade surplus economies currently, you would immediately find that nobody would want to hold that currency of a country which is internationally indebted, which doesn't have industries, so on and so forth. And yet you find the opposite. in the case of the United States. That, to our mind, forms the core of imperialism. So in that sense, it's far stronger. When you are an economic hegemon, when you are an industrial hegemon, when you're exporting capital, when you're exporting goods internationally, then establishing imperialism or having imperialism, it's in your face. But when you have the exact opposite, and yet you have the dominance of this currency, then there's something far more, nuanced, yes, but lies at the core of this, which forms the way one looks at imperialism today. The question is why? Why is it the case that you have that? And this is just to give you a broad, I mean, everybody knows, but still, you can see that for the world, about 63% of its currency is held in USD despite these problems. Emerging market economies, it's even more, 67% is held in dollars. And look at the other currencies. I mean, yen is not much, pound is not so much either. Euro at some point was challenging, but there's no challenge at all left. So you essentially have dollar dominating the portfolio foreign exchange of all the countries. Why is that the case? Is something that we need to understand, and that forms, as I said, the core of imperialism, US imperialism today. This is one reason, one obvious thing that works in favor of the dollar is that it's a currency which has been stable. Its value has remained stable, and that's something which gives it the confidence in the people to stay with the US dollar. But that is not happening because they can suppress the periphery, and they are trying to maintain low inflation in their own economy. There's something different there, which is what I will try and show. And the rest of it is basically data, so I'll probably quickly go through this. The question is, why does it command the place of reserve currency in the world? Number one is the fact that every other big currency is essentially tethered to the USD. So if USD collapses, then all the major currencies of the advanced economies would also collapse. And you can see that by and large, I mean, the black line is the end of the Bretton Woods system. After that, there is fluctuation, but it has not been a consistent fall or a consistent rise in any of the currencies. It's by and large been moving around for all these countries, which essentially means that they are all linked to each other and move together. And dollar has actually not, it's not a currency which has consistently depreciated or has lost value vis-a-vis any particular currency, big currency. The question is, why is the USD still? I mean, one could argue based on this that then we can just pick any currency, as if it's only about being stability within currencies, then any currency can be. Why not franc? Why not, let's say, yen or British pound? They're all stable. We just pick one, so it's a unit of account. Dollar just happens to be the unit of account, and that's why it's the reserve currency. And our argument is, and we would like to say that that's not, I mean, of course, it is a unit of account, but it's not the only thing. There's something beyond that. And that beyond is the following, is that despite having lost in industry, despite having lost in terms of running huge international debt, there's one thing on which they have a marked edge, which is technology. And that technological edge that it commands, even as rapid deindustrialization takes place, gives the primacy to that US dollar. So that's one important component. The other component is that that currency, which I had said earlier, is actually quite stable. You know, in the 1970s, as you know, the oil crisis, when the dollar started losing its value, when there were hyperinflation in the first world with the oil crisis, there was a run away from dollar and other currencies. But the way and hence it is important to understand that any reserve currency would require inflation to be stable. If the inflation is not stable, the value of that currency would be lost. And why is that the case is what forms the core of the argument that we are making. As you can see again in this data, if you look at the 1970s, this was the period of very high inflation in the first world countries. These are the 5 countries we've chosen, and this is from 1960 to 2016. So 70s and early 80s were the worst phase as far as the stability of currencies was concerned. But post mid 1980s, you can see inflation has come back to a low and a stable level. There is no jump in inflation that is taking place. This stability in inflation is something which is important and which needs to be explained, because that is what, apart from the technological edge, gives the stability to the US dollar. And so this I will skip. Let me come to the meat of the argument, which is what has kept the inflation under check. Those of you who have done, who know Phillips curve, I mean, all of you would know, you're students of economics, that there's something very interesting that you find if you look at the United States. The Phillips curve is downward sloping, so on and so forth, between inflation and unemployment. So high unemployment would mean a very weak working class, in which case the inflation would be low. But with low unemployment rates, working class becomes far more assertive, and hence you get high inflation. So this blue line you see on the left, which is from 1948 to 73, is somewhat a downward trend that you see here, between this range that you see there. If you plot it, you get a downward sloping, like the original Phillips curve as it was imagined. What you find now is far more interesting. Post 1980s, that relationship is actually broken down. With very, very low unemployment rates, you would still not find high inflation. So the working class in the core itself has lost the control in terms of bargaining over their share. So the wage price spiral is not getting, they don't need external force. Even within their own economy, the workers have lost the strength that they had earlier because of globalization. And weakened labor in the core itself is providing that stability to them, stability to their value of the currency. Obviously, as I just said, why is the working class of the core taking the hit? Lenin had talked about labor aristocracy. That has disappeared with, there's a race to the bottom. Wage share is no more determined by their own bargaining strength. Instead, what you find, and this is, just give me a minute to explain this. This is this dotted line that you see there is basically the hourly compensation of workers in the United States. And look at the lines below. Whether you look at South Korea or you look at Brazil, these are all, the emerging market economies. And you see the lines getting closer to this dotted line. What does it mean? That there's the gap, the wage gap is actually filling in. You have these countries moving up, and the workers here are essentially not. So there is no divergence in wages. There is actually a convergence in wages between the first world and the emerging market economies. Outsourcing, as I said, is one of the important reasons for why this has happened. Additionally, you obviously also have China breaking into the league. And how has it broken into the league is by becoming more competitive in manufacturing. So you can see that their terms of trade has fallen, which means that they have become far more competitive and have entered the international markets in a big way, a story that everybody knows, the export-driven growth strategy of China. And look at this, China infiltrating the US markets. This is 1985, where they were hardly present compared to 2017, where there was a huge jump that had taken place. This is vis-a-vis the US GDP, the ratio of trade balance between the US and China, and it has infiltrated the US markets. China, in its turn, actually is growing at the cost of the primary commodity producers, just as what Rosa Luxemburg had argued or what Patnaik has argued. So there is a more nuanced imperialist structure today. Instead of a capitalist core and a semi-capitalist periphery, you actually have a three-tier pyramidal structure, where the top is the United States, or top is the G7. The middle rung is the emerging market economies like China, like Taiwan, like the other Southeast Asian, I mean, not all of them, but China symbolizes that, which otherwise is part of the periphery in terms of labor, in terms of its labor reserves. But in terms of its economic growth, it's actually in the middle. And you don't have a core and periphery dual structure. It's a three-tier structure, with the lowest being represented by the primary commodity producers in the global south. So the global south itself is segregated in two parts. You can think of a core in the global south and a periphery in the global south. If you look at this structure in totality, that is what defines imperialism today, and China becomes a conduit in this kind of a framework, in this model of imperialism. And if you look at it in country terms, it may seem as China has gained, but if you look at it in terms of labor, labor has lost everywhere. China, India, Greece, Hungary. I mean, we have just given 5, 6 countries, 8 countries here, but this is consistent. Labor has lost everywhere in this process, and that is something which has the most important significance as far as this model of imperialism is concerned. This part of the presentation is more theoretical. I don't think I have the time to go into all of this. But just this last point I'll make and I'll end. Is you can think of the model of imperialism in the following manner. Let's say that you actually have 3 commodities, and this is a more analytical argument that one is making. Services are being produced in the United States, manufactured goods by China, and primary commodities in the African subcontinent. Now, this is obviously not true. I mean, there is agriculture in China also, primary commodities also in China, but predominantly, what do these economies do is these 3. So, the 3 sectoral thing that we always do in economics, you now have it at the global level. Services in the US, manufacturing in China, and primary commodities in the African subcontinent. This kind of division of production is what captures imperialism today. And as you know, the only way China can create a market in the US is if its own prices are cheaper than the world prices. So a real devaluation of yuan. Now that they can do only if their own working people, their wages are suppressed, because that's how you keep the cost low. And when they do that, they also in the process are suppressing the commodities that they are buying from, let's say, the African subcontinent, the primary commodities. So it's a squeezing which starts from the top to the medium, to the middle, to the bottom, and that 3-tier structure is what defines imperialism. And this is sustained by a huge reserve army of labor in China, which pulls down the wages not just in China, but also in the United States itself. This is just some mathematical formulation of that. This is the last bit, and I'm done. So there's a declining wage share, as I had said, almost across the globe, which provides the system its price stability, because there is no wage price spiral anymore in in such a situation, in which case there is nothing which needs to replace dollar. Dollar is pretty much stable despite all the problems that it has. And China, having increased its clout, has not changed the reserve currency. I mean, it is trying, but it's still far from being the reserve currency. Euro couldn't either. So globalization is providing the US with price stability, but it comes at the cost of political instability. Because after all, a declining wage share, outsourcing is essentially going to lead to a decline in income and employment of the workers in the United States. An election of Trump, this is when he got elected, was a reflection of that. Because nobody expected him to win, but he did win. And he capitalized that political instability that arises out of this, the contradiction of this form of imperialism. The argument about closing down the frontiers, as he had been arguing, or as China is arguing that we close down our borders, is going to be counterproductive, because from Kindleberger, beggar thy neighbor policies are never going to work. And at the bottom of this pyramidal imperialist structure are the primary commodity producers, like the mining workers in the underdeveloped economies. If they become organized, if the working class in the periphery becomes organized, then sustaining the reserve currency would become increasingly difficult. So if you want to mount a challenge to this this imperialism, the model of this framework or form of imperialism, it would have to start from below, and that would require the working classes of the world genuinely, and there's a possibility of it now, of the working class of the world to unite against imperialism. All right, so that's all I wanted to say. Maybe I went over a little too fast, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. We have, I think, one question here in the chat box.
All right, let me just check. Just give me a second.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sharing. Where is the chat? Okay, yes. How do you look at Foxconn like firms operating in China with work similar to that elsewhere? So yeah, so you essentially have, the Foxconn itself is producing Apple phones, right? And they are assembling everything in China. And the benefits that they get in China are essentially in terms of starting from the basic component to making the iPhone. All of that can be done, let's say, in a single SEZ where they produce this. And then there's a stamp of Apple, and then the same thing sells for a much, much higher price in the international market. And the reason why, and who keeps that extra, that margin that you have, it's essentially Apple, because of the IPR that it has. So it's not producing anything. I mean, not even the chip which is there in that iPhone, and yet it makes most of the profits out of that. So yes, I mean, that itself shows the way this system essentially is working. What if the dollar actually becomes unstable as a currency and fails miserably someday? How disastrous will it be for? So yes, if the dollar collapses, then in the period that it collapses, obviously the financial system would collapse. Think of the time when there was a transition from pound sterling to the US dollar. After all, dollar became the reserve currency only in the post First World War situation. I mean, it around the Great Depression, actually interwar period, when the reserve currency shift happened. So prior to that, obviously there was a different currency. Pound sterling was the reserve currency, and it huge period of adjustment of the Great Depression, and for that long, for the system to adjust to a new currency. Now, what would happen, one doesn't know, but this much is sure, that if the reserve currency is destabilized, then the financial system would collapse. It's not in the interest of the finance capital to let the dollar collapse, and hence there are ways and means in which they would cling on to it and not let it collapse. But if it so happens, let's say if there's inflationary situation, or people lose confidence in dollar and move out of dollar, then it would destabilize the financial system. Will the pandemic going to flip the Phillips curve back to normal? No, not at all. In fact, the pandemic is going to flatten the Phillips curve even more, because the pandemic has weakened the working people across the globe. I mean, not just in the peripheral countries, but in the first world countries, with people having lost their jobs and in very precarious condition. Phillips curve is, after all, about the bargaining strength of the workers, right? And if you're losing jobs, or if you're in a situation where you know that you may not have a job tomorrow, then unionization and the wage price spiral, the source of it itself, disappears, and it makes it more of a flatter Phillips curve, let alone it being coming back to the normal. I think that the normal days of Phillips curve are over. There is no such thing as Phillips curve anymore.
I think those are all the questions that we have received as of yet.
Okay. All right. So I guess, yeah, that should be.
Okay. So we'll just then. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear you.
So we'll just then. The video will be available on YouTube. Anybody can log in and check this whole session all over again. We'll end the session here right now. We haven't received any more questions yet. So a big thank you to Rohit sir for actually addressing this session today. We are extremely fortunate for having you here with us today. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks, Anubhav. Thank you for organizing this, and all the best for what you're doing. And I think it's very good to have these alternative platforms where you can discuss things which goes beyond the textbooks, beyond what you're normally taught in classes. So I'm delighted that you have such a society in Jadavpur. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So I leave now. Thanks.
Yes, sir.